Welcome to Soul Power Trip, the podcast that is your compass for manifesting your dream life. I'm Priscilla, a Jungian life coach with a master's in psychology, and I am your guide through the realms of the unconscious mind. This has been my life's work, reaching my potential as well as guiding you towards reaching yours. In this podcast, together we cultivate positive habits, learn useful tips, and gain transformative insight. So fasten your seatbelts, dear listeners, as we embark on this trip of a lifetime, a journey to the very core of your beautiful soul. Welcome to Soul Power Trip. Hi, and welcome. So imagine your past relationships and early life experiences as a training ground for your heart. So if that training involved like high stakes obstacle courses of emotional unpredictability and, some surprise gifts coming out of the sky and then some surprise bombs, your heart training was this sort of roller coaster of emotions, then a person or a relationship that seems calm and consistent might feel like you've been benched. It just doesn't feel right. You've been sidelined from the adrenaline pumping action you've come to associate with love and connection. Personally, that was a really hard pill to swallow. I'll get into that a little bit later, but especially if you grew up in a stressful, unstable, or unpredictable household like I did, you are going to have an urge, a strong subconscious desire to imitate or relive past experiences in a new relationship. You don't have this urge because it was a pleasant experience, because you consciously want to mimic your parents' relationship, but it's simply because it's familiar. Part of our unconscious believes that if we repeat the past, we can gain mastery over what couldn't be controlled as a child. The unconscious believes that reliving it is the key to healing it, right? This is a psychological phenomenon called repetition compulsion, which is a term that was first coined by Sigmund Freud. He defined it as the desire to return to an earlier state of things. The repetition compulsion comes up in your life in a lot of ways you may not be aware of. If you oftentimes find yourself dating someone who is emotionally unavailable or emotionally abusive, right, or verbally abusive, if you engage in risky or self-destructive or self-sabotaging behaviors, if you always find yourself procrastinating, if you have a habit of starting and stopping new habits you want to incorporate in your life, like a better diet or exercise, you have trouble saying no or maintaining boundaries, you engage in addictive behavior, or you're accident prone or even moving around a lot, are all behaviors that could be rooted in this compulsion to repeat your past. So let's take a soul power trip to find out why this happens and how to heal. Something I always find fascinating is the root of these type of issues, because people can often think, oh, I didn't go through a bad trauma or physical abuse or anything too bad, so I'm not sure this applies to me because my childhood was quote unquote good. But even though your childhood could technically have been overall good, there's no way it was perfect. And there's a good chance there's a few wounds you acquired when you were a child that are still coming up today. And that's totally okay, right? It doesn't mean you had a bad childhood or you had bad parents. It's not you being a bad daughter or son if you say, my childhood wasn't perfect. It just means you're a human. There's nothing wrong with that. So, the repetition compulsion, the psychological phenomena I mentioned, often stems from conflict, trauma, or it's as simple as stemming from unmet needs during childhood or earlier stages in life. And I'd say unmet needs are the most common trauma response I've seen, because the unmet need doesn't seem like it'd be traumatic, but the problem is that if you had a sibling who required a lot more attention than you did, if your parents had just gotten a promotion, had just leveled up in their career right when you just happened to be born, they are not going to meet your needs the way they did for your siblings, or the way they might have met your needs in another part of their lives, because they were just too busy. And that could lead to this feeling of neglect or abandonment. Unfortunately, those unmet needs are now leading you to be in situations that you're not happy with, whether it's relationships, career, or your personal life. It could even affect your confidence or how you feel about yourself because it's rooted from this core experience. And I just want to make clear that it doesn't mean you had a bad childhood. It just means, you picked up some scars that are still coming up today that need to be addressed. With the repetition compulsion, the psyche is trying to recreate a situation to gain a sense of control and to find a better resolution, right? So here are some obvious and some not so obvious underlying experiences that might have led you to have an unconscious urge to repeat the past in adulthood. This comes up in some ways that we might think are obvious, such as traumatic experiences, but it can also come up in some not so obvious ways, right? Some very relatable experiences that a lot of us might have gone through that we aren't aware are the cause and the root of this repetition compulsion. So, some experience that might have led you to have an unconscious urge to repeat the past in adulthood. One is childhood neglect or abandonment. An individual who didn't receive adequate attention or care, either physical or emotional, also counts. Neglect could happen even in the smallest ways. If your parents weren't around because they were working too hard, like I just mentioned, or they didn't comfort you when you cried or when you were angry, or if something happened at school and you're like, hey, there's somebody who's been not so nice to me, and your parents didn't stand up for you, didn't protect you, or didn't, show obvious signs of, oh, I'm going to go in and defend you, then this is all going to fall under the category of neglect, right? Of course, you're going to have a repetition compulsion if you experienced emotional, physical, or sexual abuse in your childhood. Also, if you witnessed or were a part of constant parental conflict, can lead to comfort with chaos. This was one of my personal experiences. My parents would fight a lot, so chaos was pretty much my comfort zone. I felt like if I was at peace, I was bored. If there wasn't drama, if there wasn't toxicity, it just wasn't for me, right? Which is something that I really had to work on undoing. An experience that could lead to a repetition compulsion is losing a loved one at a young age, especially if it was sudden or not properly mourned. A loss at times isn't intentional, maybe they didn't particularly choose to die, it'll still leave the same type of pain and makes you seek out situations that represent or bring a similar feeling of loss or abandonment. Whether that means you attract emotionally unavailable men who won't ever commit and they'll end up abandoning you, it's because of this core wound of feeling abandoned, even if it wasn't intentional abandonment. If you had any sort of attachment issues when you were growing up, which is extremely common, you're going to have a compulsion to repeat that in your adulthood. If you had unmet emotional needs, which I touched on before, if you experienced bullying or social exclusion, I thought this one was kind of interesting because it could be surprising to some of us. The past experience of being bullied or excluded can lead to an adult life where the repetition compulsion leads you to subconsciously tolerate or gravitate towards social or work environments where you are going to be marginalized, where you are going to feel the same sense of isolation, of not enoughness, of you aren't worthy of being included, and you're actually going to seek out those situations if you had a similar experience in your childhood. Also, if you grew up in a family of substance abuse issues, you're also going to have a compulsion to repeat or look for people with substance abuse issues later in life. Additionally, enmeshment or a lack of boundaries. Growing up in an environment without healthy boundaries, like those who grew up with helicopter or intrusive parents, can lead to an adult relationship that is enmeshed and codependent, which means they're repeating the cycle of blurred personal boundaries. They never learned to have personal boundaries because their parents did not have boundaries with them. They wanted to enmesh with their child. They almost wanted to live through their child, right? This is the intrusive parent experience. And lastly, another childhood experience that could lead you to have a repetition compulsion in adulthood is constant pressure to perform or to be perfect. So, whether it is in academics, sports, or behaviors, this can create a cycle in adulthood characterized by stress and an unforgiving attitude towards oneself or others because you had the experience of being pushed to be perfect as a child, and now you're going to push yourself and others to be perfect in adulthood, right? So you can see clearly why it's so important to recognize where this compulsion is coming from, because you're going to live out this cycle over and over if you're not aware of where it's coming from. Whether it's no boundaries, perfectionism, loss, neglect, or exclusion, you might find it difficult to end that cycle. And the reason it's difficult to end the cycle is because we're experiencing a compulsion, which is a term also used to describe OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. A compulsion is an uncontrollable urge, but opposed to OCD, in this case, it's not obsessive, which means it's not conscious and not purposeful. Rather, it's a learned response to do what we already know, to do what we're already familiar with. And this type of compulsion to repeat the past is deeply ingrained, and it's hard to change or break the cycle for a few reasons. Number one is because chaos feels familiar. Something I had to affirm to myself at some point in my life, which was, this is peaceful, this is not boring. This is peaceful, this is not boring. When I don't have chaos or high stress situations in my life, I feel disoriented. I used to feel very uncomfortable with that because chaos was so familiar. This is because as children, we absorbed everything. So if a child is brought up in a chaotic household, experiencing a parent with narcissistic tendencies or any mental health difficulties, or frequently observing abuse, including verbal abuse, not just physical abuse, then they have no reason to believe that this environment is not normal. What could the kid compare their childhood experience to? How could they know any different? Maybe you might think, oh, they were exposed to television or movies that showed them that there's a different or healthier way to live. It's very easy for the brain to say, oh, that's just a fantasy, that's just TV, that's just the movies, that's not realistic, that's never going to happen for me, right? So, a healthy dynamic, if you don't physically experience it in your younger years, it's so hard to understand how that's even possible, how that's even a realistic thing that happens in life. So when you're older, you actually end up being suspicious of a relationship with someone who is not a reflection of your chaotic upbringing. It's so important because the cycle needs to be broken. By listening to this, by being here, by working on your self-improvement, you're already starting the process of breaking the cycle, and it's not easy, so I commend you for being here. Another reason why breaking the cycle is so difficult, similar to what I just mentioned, is that healthy dynamics are seen as abnormal. The preference for familiar chaos is so strong because of our animal and primal brain that associates whatever is unknown or unpredictable with a threat to your survival and possible death. Because some part of you is associating a healthy relationship with a possible threat to your survival. So when you try to be in a healthy relationship, you're going to have major pushback from this primal animalistic part of your brain. And it's going to be very easy to fall back into what's familiar and not push through breaking that cycle. Another reason it's hard to break the cycle is because we might start to believe that there's no point in trying to stop or break this cycle or break the compulsion because it's just the way things are. You choose not to take action to look for anything different because it doesn't seem worth it, which of course is an error. It's not your destiny to repeat your parents' life. You are actually destined to break this cycle. Also, when we go through these childhood experiences, it's difficult to change because we end up having unregulated emotional reactions in response to unfortunate or negative circumstances. So when you were younger, your parent or caregiver may have shut down, got upset, or, didn't comfort you, right? So when the child grows up, they have internalized that they deserve to be mistreated and there's no reason for them actually to be upset. So when you're in a toxic or unhealthy relationship dynamic, you have already internalized the belief that that's how things are. So it's going to be difficult to break that cycle because you just don't truly believe that you're worth more. Your brain and your unconscious works against you in this way. So another reason breaking the habit of a repetition compulsion is difficult because we have a tendency to try to recreate past traumatic events with someone new because part of you believes that you can fix them. And byproduct, if you fix them, you can heal yourself. This part of you believes that if you change the outcome, you can thereby gain a sense of control that you didn't have as a child. So, for example, you might think that if you act nicer, perform better, or use the right words, the partner won't abuse you because it thinks that repeating it, reliving it, and fixing it is the only way you can heal. Some psychologists actually believe that this happens because we have an innate desire to complete something that's already begun. So if you've already begun, for example, a toxic relationship with your dad, who might have always been caught hot and cold with you, sometimes affirmed you and said, I'm so proud of you, and sometimes didn't, sometimes completely disappeared and was too engulfed by their work to even pay attention to you. Okay. That's a relationship that was already started that you feel is unfinished because there's unhealed parts of you that came out of that relationship with your dad. So now you are going to mimic that in a relationship with somebody who also sometimes is affirming to you and sometimes is very cold with you. Sometimes more so than being cold, they might actually put you down, right? Sometimes they say you're amazing and sometimes they say, how are you so stupid? Your brain believes that if you can fix them, if you can make them be the person that they are when they are good to you, and if you can eliminate the parts of them that are bad, if you can take on this project, control it, and fix it and change the outcome, then it would heal the wound that your father left in you from treating you the same way. Unfortunately, that's never going to happen. You can never fix somebody else, and that's never going to heal you, right? The only way to get to be healed is to heal yourself first, heal that relationship with your dad by doing some deep inner work with yourself, and then seeking out new types of relationships that you've never been exposed to, that you might have only been exposed to in movies and TV, right? That's the way to heal, is by pushing through these barriers and saying, I am releasing the idea that I can fix somebody. I'm releasing the idea that by fixing somebody, I can fix myself. I'm releasing the idea that I don't deserve better. Releasing any sort of attachment to the challenges or walls that I mentioned that would prevent you from breaking this repetition compulsion. That's how you heal, right? Parts of you aren't going to fully understand that. So it's important to just, instead of trying to work with it and being like, oh, maybe part of me is right in trying to fix that person. No, no, no. You can't even try to like logic with this part of you. You just have to let it go and just be like, you're wrong. I'm not going to argue with why you're wrong. I'm not going to argue with the fact that you have an urge to complete something that we can never complete. And you have an urge to fix people and to take on projects because you think that's going to make me better. I'm not even going to argue with you. I'm just going to choose to be different. I'm going to choose to live a different reality because that is no longer for me, period. Without more to be said on that. The last reason I wanted to mention that it might be hard to break this cycle of a repetition compulsion is if you don't remember the past trauma. So there's research that suggests that to cope with a traumatic event, our brain blocks our capacity to remember it at all, right? So the repetition compulsion might come up and you might not even remember the traumatic event that caused that compulsion. So it's important to be aware of that because you might have like a little inkling as to why you keep putting yourself in these sort of patterns, but you can't recall the time where you had a similar experience in your past, it might be because your brain blocked that out to protect you. So, when someone finds themselves in a calm and peaceful relationship, they might misinterpret the lack of drama as a lack of passion or lack of depth of feeling. And that person might walk away from a good relationship because they're missing that intensity that's actually not associated with love. It's more associated with chaos and toxicity. The addiction to the roller coaster also happens on a biological level. High drama relationships trigger the release of adrenaline and dopamine, chemicals that make us feel good and excited. So these relationships function exactly like a drug, where the individual craves the high of intense emotions. A stable relationship doesn't trigger the same chemical rush, making it feel a lot less exciting by comparison. Awareness of the association between things like, a relationship being easy, meaning that it's boring, a relationship meet that being a relationship with someone that you don't have to fix means that something's missing. These are beliefs that you have to go in and break. Lastly, and I found this one pretty interesting. So if a person's identity has been shaped during the midst of relational turmoil, so if you were forming your identity while your parents' relationship was tumultuous, or while your own relationship with a significant partner in your life was tumultuous, as in, you had a toxic relationship in your early teens, right? You might feel uncertain about who you are in the absence of a toxic relationship. Without conflict or push against or chaos to manage, you might feel like you're just stuck, which can be misinterpreted as bored. It feels as though the chaos and the challenge that they brought into your life is part of who you are, which makes it really hard to stay in healthy and calm relationships. So, I just mentioned a lot of things that you need to be aware of to break the cycle of thinking healthy relationships are boring, to start moving towards the new belief system that healthy relationships are beautiful, amazing, and most importantly, they are your destiny and they're what you really want. Part of you doesn't believe that what you really want is a healthy relationship. Part of you might believe that what you really want is chaos. What you really want is to fix these wounds by fixing somebody else, right? You need to go in and rewrite those beliefs to now say, I think a boring relationship is a perfect relationship for me. I think a safe relationship where I don't question if they're into me because they're hot and cold is exactly what I want. With repetition, that's going to reflect in your reality. The next step is to try to notice where this pattern comes up in your life. The type of partners you choose? Is it in your inability to say no even when you don't want to say yes, but you just don't know how to set proper boundaries? Is this where the repetition compulsion is coming from? Is it in your procrastination habit? That's a replay of what you saw when you were younger. Look at the patterns in your life that you're not happy with. And from there, I recommend that you journal about what in your childhood relates to that pattern. Who taught you that was okay? Journal about it to really find the root. Once you've identified the core experience, now it's much easier to notice the pattern and choose to act differently when it comes up. Specifically, when reorienting your taste buds to seek out a stable relationship, remember if you don't feel that adrenaline and dopamine spike, cancel the belief that means it's boring. That actually means good. That means safety. That means that's exactly what you desire. It's a bit like having a palate accustomed to extra spicy food, and suddenly well seasoned dishes seem bland because they lack flavor. But that's just because our taste buds are desensitized, right? So approach this rewriting your unconscious limiting beliefs in the same way. You've desensitized taste buds who are now comfortable with toxicity. You need to rewire your taste buds, which is going to take some time, but it's more than possible. It's about learning to savor the subtleties of trust, the richness of reliability, the depth of a drama-free connection. It's in this retraining that we discover healthy relationships aren't boring. They're just a different genre of adventure. Working through repetition compulsion can be helped by therapeutic intervention. And of course, you can always start working with me, and together we work on recognizing these patterns, understanding their origin, and developing a healthier way of relating to others. I do believe that therapy is one of the best ways to overcome this compulsion because, again, it is pretty hard to navigate these unconscious realms without somebody who's trained in working in these unconscious limiting beliefs in this unconscious mind. So that is it for today. We have reached the end of our soul power trip. Of course, don't forget to use the Q&A section below this episode to ask me any questions you would like. I might start adding a Q&A section at the end of each episode. Bye for now. Thanks for listening. I will see you next Tuesday for our next soul power trip. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week.